Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting some root vegetables using watercolor and colored pencils. I just think that they're so fun and colorful, so let's begin by sketching it out. So prior to sketching, I already thought about what sort of vegetables I want to include in my painting. You can also add things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, ginger, and things like that for more variation in shapes. But I was looking for something a bit more colorful, which is why I stuck with these selections. I decided to pick things like daikon, beetroot, turnips, carrots, which comes in all sorts of colors. But the tricky thing about this is the placement because they're all quite long in terms of length, which is why I found that the planning portion for sketching is quite important. For the chosen vegetables, I decided to first scatter them along the sides and corners of my paper to draw them out. I also started with basic shapes like circles and ovals before adding the connected root at the bottom if I find the shapes a bit tricky to draw out. In terms of the leaves of these vegetables, I find that they would add some nice green color and interesting textures. So for some, if I have the space, I would just indicate the shapes very loosely in the beginning to help with the rest of the composition. Once I fill in the sides and corners, I'd fill the rest of the center depending on the shape that I have left. I also decided to add some alliums for a bit of variation. Now that everything is drawn loosely and I get a better visualization of the spacing, if I'm okay with the spacing of some of the vegetables, then I would slowly clean out the lines. I, however, didn't realize at this time that the spacing is a bit weird on the bottom left since the onion and the turnip is a bit too big compared to all the other elements. If you realize things like this, I would definitely fix it before cleaning out the lines in case you need to shift things around so you don't waste your time cleaning or redrawing certain elements then having to erase it again due to the lack of balance in the composition. When I finally realized that the turnips were a bit distracting, I already cleaned up most of the elements, so I'm going to use the same amount of spacing and add 2 turnips instead to try to fill in the space without having to move other elements. If you noticed here, I didn't really clean the lines for the leaves that well. I feel like I can do them later on once I'm ready to paint, and this way I can be a bit more flexible with how I paint them later. Next, here are the colors. This is Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Rose of Ultramarine by Daniel Smith, Sepia by Holbein, Chinese White by Holbein, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Sap Green by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. I'll also be using colored pencils to outline, and I'm using these hobby grade watercolor color pencils, and since they're hobby grade they don't really have names, instead they have numbers for the colors, and here they are in case you want specific colors. You can also use ink to outline if that's easier for you. Okay, let's begin to paint. I'm going to start by using a mix of New Gamboge, Chinese White, and a touch of sepia. I want the color to be very light because I'm going to paint the base color of the parsnip on the top. If you don't like this type of light colors, you can also turn this into a carrot since they come in a variety of colors. So I first begin by using a medium to light consistency, and I'm painting at the left side, top, and also bottom, then continuing the rest with a clean damp brush. And I also use a slightly darker version of the color to paint the root so it's more visible. Next, I'm going to paint the base color of the daikon. For this, I'm using the same color as before, but with added Chinese White, New Gamboge, and this time a bit of Sap Green. I want this color to first be a little bit creamy, and I'm starting from the bottom, then continuing upwards using a clean damp brush. As I get towards the top, I would slowly add a bit more sap green into the mix, and right at the very tip, I would just use sap green as is, and I'm going to let it flow. If it's a little bit hard for the paint to flow, I would then help it with my brush and just pull downwards. For the bottom, just like before, I'm going to use a slightly darker version of the base color since I am painting on a very tiny surface. I want it to still show through. I'm still going to work with the same base color as the daikon, but this time I'm adding a bit of Quin Sienna and also Rose of Ultramarine, but I'm going to add a lot of Chinese white into this. So the base color is still a neutral creamy color, but this time has a slight tint of pink. And again, for the bottom or the root of this vegetable, I decided to use a darker version of the same color with added sepia. If you guys have been following me for a while, you guys know that the paper that I'm using in the sketchbook is mostly damaged, so the paint seeps in instead of staying on top of the paper. This is why I have to move the paint manually with my brush, even if I'm painting on a damp surface. But assuming your paper is still in peak condition, I would use this mix of Rose of Ultramarine with Quin Sienna for the top part of the turnip while the surface of the base color is still a bit damp, and I would just let the color slowly bloom out and travel downwards with the base color so it has more of a natural wet on wet blend. I'm going to do the same thing for the second turnip. For the color of the first turnip to not seep into the second one, I would either wait for the previous turnip to completely dry, or you can also use a hair dryer, or you can also leave a little bit of white negative space in between so the wet paint isn't touching each other, which then creates a barrier between those two areas. You see that I'm not doing that for mine because the paper is damaged, so the paint doesn't bleed. Instead, it seeps into the paper. But please don't be fooled, this damaged paper is actually harder to control, but I don't have to worry about colors bleeding into each other, and that's basically it. Next, I'm going to paint the red radishes. For this, I used the previous parsnip purple with added Quin Red and a lot of Chinese white to create this pinkish purple red color. And while the surface is still damp, I'm going to use the same mix with less Chinese white in the ratio while moving the paint around, but leaving one side with the base or the light color. For the bottom, I also used the darker version of that color. I'm also going to do the same thing for the second one. As you can see, I'm moving the paint around a lot though. This is for the exact same reason that my paper is damaged, but assuming that your paper is in good condition, you don't have to move the paint as much as what I'm doing here. Once I'm done, I'm going to move on to the carrot. I decided to erase some of the outline because I felt like the pencil marks were a bit dirty, so I decided to lighten it. As for the color, I used a mix of New Gamboge with Quin Red. On the left, I thought that I wanted to paint a radish, but I decided to turn it into another carrot. So I'm just going to erase it and re-outline the shape. Then for this one, I'm going to use the same mix, but with more New Gamboge, so the color becomes lighter and a bit more yellow. Once I'm done, I'm going to move on to the beetroot on the top right corner. For this, I used a mix of Quin Red and Quin Sienna. I'm using a medium consistency to cover the whole base color. I kind of realized that this also flattens it because the surface area is supposed to be quite round, so I would prefer to use a lighter consistency than paint it sort of like the radish, using a darker or a thicker consistency to paint the sides, so there's a bit of highlight and more of a roundness to it, but I'm going to fix this using bleed-proof white later on. For the onion here, I used the same color as the beetroot with added New Gamboge to make it a bit more yellow and orangey. And for this one, I used a lighter consistency, and while the surface is still a bit damp, I use a thicker consistency of the same mix to paint on some lines or textures for the onion skin. I still have the color of the onion in my brush, and I added more Chinese white into it to create this creamy color that I'm going to use to paint the base color of the garlic. Then I used some of the purple that I already have on my palette to paint the bottom part of the garlic cloves, and then I'm going to drag some of the paint upward so the top part of the garlic has a bit of a lighter purple. As for the red radish here, I decided to only use Quin Red as the top part of the radish. Then I added a bit of Chinese white to use for the bottom part, which is a bit more pinkish. After the first carrot dried up, I felt like the color was a bit too pale, so I'm going to add more of the same color. This time I'm going to add more on the top left side and a little bit lighter on the right hand side. I'm going to move on to paint the greeneries. I first erased the pencil marks and I'm starting with the garlic. I used the same green as the daikon, but I added a bit more sap green, and I just basically painted vertical lines with the top being a bit wavy or a bit curvy. For the onion here, I used sap green with Quin Sienna, and I'm using a medium to thick consistency to paint V's, getting smaller as I get towards the top. For the beetroot, I'm going to start by painting the stem using Quin Red, and I'm going to wait for this to dry, then use a bit of the green that I already have on my palette with a bit of new Gamboge, so it's a bit more yellow-green, and I'm painting wavy lines as the leaves. If I'm painting some overlapping leaves at the back, I would use a bit more sap green in the mix to create a darker value. For the daikon leaves, I'm just going to use a very thick consistency of sap green mixed into the yellow green that I already had on my palette, and I'm just going to paint on lines which grows from the same point, and I tried to play around with the length. After that, I'm going to use a bit of Quin Sienna mixed with sap green to paint the base so it becomes a little bit more brown and slightly darker. For the stem of the carrot leaves, I'm using a medium to thick consistency of sap green with a little bit of new Gamboge. I'm making the stem nice and long. Then I'm going to paint on some wiggly lines for the small leaves, which connects to those stems. For the stem of the radish leaves, I'm starting using a light green from the daikon, and then I'm going to follow this up by using sap green to paint the top part of the stem. As for the leaves, I'm creating the same wavy leaves as the other vegetables, and I'm using the same light green. This is from sap green, new Gamboge, and a bit of Chinese white. As for the overlapping leaves, I would just add a bit more sap green in the ratio to create a darker value of the same color. Since I already have a lot of green on my palette, I'm just going to pick a light green to paint the stem for the carrot leaf here. And as for the parsnip, I use a little bit of the brown green from Quin Sienna and sap green, and just sap green for the top part. Moving on to the turnip, I'm going to erase the pencil marks first, and as for the color, I'm going to add Chinese white to the mix of new Gamboge, sap green, and Quin Sienna. I'm just going to paint on curvy lines in different lengths, and I'm also going to add some of the light purples so there's a little bit of variation of color. Same goes for the leaves. Sometimes I like to use the light green, or sometimes I like to also add some of the light purple into the green, creating more of a muted tone. For the leaves, I'm painting it in a similar way. I like to outline the shape first and fill in the rest of the color. For this one, I'm making the same wavy leaves, but I tried to make the tip a little bit wider than the other ones. Since the stems are also longer, sometimes I like to make smaller leaves which are unattached to the larger ones. And of course, for the overlapping leaves, I like to vary the color so they don't all just blend into each other. Once I'm done with the base color, I'm just going to erase the extra pencil marks so it's a little bit cleaner. Looking at the carrots again, I felt like they were a little bit pale and I want everything to be a bit more saturated, so I'm just going to layer on the same colors as before. Next, I'm going to add the outline and the textures. I'm going to use my colored pencils, but as I mentioned before, you can also use ink pen if you don't have any colored pencils. For the turnips, I'm using a reddish brown color, and I felt here like it looks a little bit flat, so I'm going back in with the base color, which is slightly darker in value, and I'm just going to dot around the sides, creating more of a darker area around the sides compared to the middle. And I'm also going to add textures by adding some uneven curved lines. I'm also going to do the same for the onion. This time I switched to a more muted brown color as opposed to the reddish brown. I'm starting by outlining the onion and then adding the small roots at the bottom. And I'm also going to add the curved lines in the middle, following the curvature of the onion. For the bottom and the top, I made the lines a bit closer together to create a darker value. I'm going back to the reddish brown again to paint the red radish, and I just outlined them because I felt like the color already gave enough information for the form. Using the same color, I'm going to paint around the beetroot, and I'm pressing quite a lot because the base color was quite dark, and I just try to darken the sides even more so the middle is a little bit lighter. For the parsnip, I'm going back to my muted brown colored pencil. I started by outlining the sides, and I'm also going to darken the value by adding texture at the same time, using curved lines in different lengths. Then as I get towards the middle, I added longer curved lines, again in different lengths, but I made them a little bit more scattered and a bit further apart. I'm also going to do something similar to the carrots, but since the color is already quite distinct, I'm not going to add too much curved lines around the sides. For the garlic, I'm using this muted reddish purple color, and I first outlined the sides as well as the individual cloves. Then I added curved lines according to the cross contour to create the volume, and I pressed a little bit less so the lines are a bit lighter. For the daikon, here I'm treating it sort of like the carrot, and I'm using this muted brown color, but I don't want to press too much because I don't want to lose the green of the daikon. In fact, I actually switched halfway through using a muted green color, so some of the textures are a bit more earthy and some are a bit more green. Still using this green, I'm going to outline all of the leaves, and this is just to make the outlines a little bit cleaner. And if the leaves are kind of light, I'm going to add the midrib as well as the veins. For the beetroot stem, I'm going to extend the length with this reddish brown. I'm also going to use the same color to draw on the veins. Then for the outline, I just use the green. I think you guys have the basic idea by now, so I'm just going to continue on to add on outlines as well as textures using different colors that I feel matches each of the vegetables. Once I'm done with the textures, I'm going to add some highlights using bleed-proof white, especially for the beetroot here, just to lighten an area to make it a bit more round. For the red radish, I want to make this look glossy, so I made some larger highlights. And I'm also going to add some thin curved lines for the carrots. I'm not going to add too much though, because I find too much white might make it look a bit too distracting. As for the rest of the space, I felt like some spaces are a bit awkward, so I'm going to fill it in by drawing out some leaves. And considering this is watercolor colored pencils, you can actually just use clean water and use the pigment that's already on the outline. I also felt like adding a bit more color in the composition to make it look more cheery, so I picked up some of the lighter colors that I've already mixed on my palette to add some dots as well as short lines. This is optional though. If you like the cleaner look, you can also leave it as is. And that's the completed painting or doodle, however you guys want to classify it. If you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to support this channel. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!